The first encounter. Camille Price stepped through the doors of Le Rivage, one of the finest restaurants in the city, and let out a quiet breath. Her heels clicked against the marble floors as she walked, her posture graceful but alert. She wore a sleek black dress that hugged her figure, with her dark curls cascading over one shoulder. A warm smile played on her lips, but inside, she felt a twinge of discomfort. She loved this place, her husband Daniel's pride and joy. But something about being here alone made her feel uneasy. Daniel was wrapping up a meeting across town and had told her to head to the restaurant ahead of him. "Order anything you want, love. I'll be there soon," he had said on the phone. Normally, they came here together, and the staff treated her like royalty. But tonight, as she stood waiting to be seated, the hostess at the front gave her only the faintest nod of acknowledgement, her eyes barely flickering toward Camille's direction. "Table for one?" the hostess asked, her tone neutral. Camille forced a polite smile. "Actually, I'll be joined by my husband soon. I'd like a table by the window, please." The hostess gave a tight-lipped smile, glanced down at her reservation list, and then motioned toward a table in the corner, away from the windows, where the view of the waterfront sparkled. Camille's smile faltered slightly, but she kept her composure. It was just a table after all. No need to make a fuss. As she settled into her seat, Camille took in the atmosphere. Le Rivage was buzzing with quiet conversation and soft laughter. Couples clinked glasses of expensive wine, and the dim candlelight gave the space an intimate, romantic feel. Yet she couldn't shake the gnawing sense of discomfort creeping in. Something felt off. A waiter appeared at her side, tall and lean, with neatly combed blonde hair. His name tag read Garrett, and his expression was pinched and cold. He barely glanced at Camille, his eyes flicking over her without any real acknowledgement. "Can I get you anything to drink?" he asked, his tone flat and perfunctory. Camille blinked at his abruptness. Usually, the waitstaff at Le Rivage were warm and welcoming, but Garrett's demeanor felt like a splash of cold water. She offered a polite smile, hoping to break the tension. "I'll just have some water for now, please," she said. Garrett gave a short nod and turned away without another word. Camille's gaze followed him as he moved across the restaurant, noticing the way his demeanor changed entirely when he reached another table. There, he offered a wide smile, laughing easily with an older couple who wore designer clothes and gleaming jewelry. He refilled their wine glasses with practiced ease, his charm on full display. Camille shifted in her seat, a knot forming in her stomach. She tried to convince herself that she was reading too much into it. Maybe he was just having a bad day. But as the minutes ticked by, her glass of water nowhere in sight, that knot tightened. She watched as Garrett continued making his rounds, weaving between tables with smooth efficiency. He refilled drinks, exchanged pleasantries, and made recommendations from the menu. Always attentive, always cheerful. But not once did he look her way. Camille glanced at her phone. Daniel had texted that he was running 10 minutes late. "Order without me if you're hungry," the message read. She drummed her fingers on the table, debating whether to flag Garrett down or wait. 5 minutes turned into 10, and then 20. Garrett passed her table 3 more times, each time ignoring her completely. Meanwhile, diners all around her were enjoying flawless service, their orders taken promptly and delivered without delay. Frustration simmered beneath Camille's calm exterior. She reminded herself to stay patient. She had seen subtle forms of bad service before, but rarely at this level. Still, tonight, the pattern was glaring. Her gut told her this wasn't just about a busy night or a distracted waiter. Finally, as Garrett passed her table yet again, Camille raised her hand slightly, catching his attention. He stopped in his tracks, but his expression didn't soften in the slightest. If anything, it hardened. "Yes?" he asked curtly, as if she were inconveniencing him. Camille kept her tone polite but firm. "I've been waiting for some water. Could you bring me a glass, please?" Garrett gave a stiff nod, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll get to it when I can. "We're very busy tonight," he said, not even attempting to mask the irritation in his voice. Camille stared at him for a moment, stunned by his audacity. She had been coming to Le Rivage since the day it opened. She knew the staff, knew the level of service that was expected. And this wasn't it. Before she could respond, Garrett turned on his heel and disappeared toward the kitchen. Camille's jaw tightened, frustration blooming into something sharper. She took another look around the restaurant, noticing the way Garrett's attitude shifted with every other guest. It was becoming painfully clear his dismissiveness wasn't random. Camille took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm brewing inside her. She had experienced moments like this before, moments where she was subtly, quietly reminded that people like her were not always welcomed with open arms in spaces like these. It was a feeling she knew well, though it never became easier to bear. But tonight, she wasn't in the mood to let it slide. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel. Almost there. 5 more minutes. She exhaled slowly, deciding to wait a little longer. But as the minutes dragged on, and Garrett continued to glide past her table without so much as a glance, the frustration gnawed at her. She wasn't just going to sit here and be treated like she didn't matter. Camille flagged down another server, a young woman with kind eyes named Sarah. She had served Camille and Daniel before, and always did so with a warm smile. "Excuse me," Camille said, her voice measured. "Could you bring me some water? I've been waiting quite a while." Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment. "Oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am. I'll get that for you right away." Within moments, Sarah returned with a glass of ice water, setting it down with an apologetic smile. "If you need anything else, just let me know." Camille nodded her thanks, but her attention was already back on Garrett. The water wasn't the issue. It was the principle. She took a slow sip, the cold liquid doing little to soothe the heat rising in her chest. As Garrett continued to laugh and chat with other guests, ignoring her as if she were invisible, Camille made a quiet decision. This wasn't over. And when Daniel arrived, Garrett was going to learn exactly who he had been mistreating. A brewing storm. Camille sat at the table, her earlier frustration simmering into a slow boil. As she waited for her water, she glanced at Ethan once again, watching as he charmed his way through the restaurant. There was a noticeable rhythm to his movements. Pour wine here, exchange jokes there, refill glasses without being asked. And yet, he still hadn't returned to her table. Not once. She tapped her fingers against the wooden table, trying to suppress the familiar, sinking feeling. This wasn't the first time she had been treated differently in an upscale establishment, but it was the first time it was happening in her own restaurant. Well, technically, it was Matthew's business, but Camille had spent years helping her husband launch and grow Bistro Nouveau. She had helped design the interior, carefully chosen the dishes on the menu, and even trained some of the early staff. The restaurant was as much hers as it was Matthew's, and tonight, that pride now mingled with anger. She couldn't shake the sense of betrayal gnawing at her. This place wasn't just a restaurant, it was a sanctuary, a labor of love. To be treated this way here, of all places, was a punch to the gut. After a few more minutes of being ignored, Camille decided she'd had enough. She raised her hand high in the air, signaling Ethan to come over. It was impossible to miss, but Ethan, still mid-conversation with a couple at the corner table, pretended not to notice. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Okay, this is how we're playing it," Camille thought, her heartbeat quickening with anger. A second later, Sarah, the young waitress who had brought her water earlier, passed by again. Camille gently touched Sarah's elbow. "Excuse me," Camille said, her voice still polite, but carrying a hard edge now. "Could you do me a favor and ask Ethan to come here? I need to place my order." Sarah gave her an apologetic smile. "Of course, ma'am. I'll get him right away." Camille watched Sarah cross the room and tap Ethan on the shoulder. From her seat, Camille could see Ethan's expression shift. First mild annoyance, then something darker. His lips tightened as Sarah gestured toward Camille's table. Reluctantly, Ethan turned, dragging his feet as though the very idea of interacting with Camille was a chore. He arrived at her table with the same lifeless, forced politeness. "What do you need?" he asked flatly, as if her request were an inconvenience. Camille stared at him for a moment, her anger barely held in check. "I'd like to place my order," she said calmly, folding her hands on the table to steady herself. "I've been waiting quite a while." Ethan shrugged as if the situation were beyond his control. "We're busy," he said dismissively. "Busy." Camille glanced around again. It was clear that every other guest was receiving attentive service. In fact, another waiter was currently setting down steaming plates of food at a nearby table. The contrast between their experience and her own was as stark as daylight. Her gaze sharpened, and she leaned slightly forward. "It seems you found the time to take care of everyone else," she said slowly, her voice low but deliberate. "But not me. Why is that, Ethan?" Ethan shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable under her steady gaze. "Like I said, we're short-staffed tonight," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Camille's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. She wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the message was becoming clearer with every passing second. Ethan had deliberately chosen to ignore her, and it wasn't just about her being seated alone. It was about who she was, or rather, who Ethan assumed she was. Ethan was about to walk away when Camille's voice stopped him cold. "I've been patient," she said, her tone sharper now. "But I need you to answer something for me. Why have you treated every other table with care and respect, but ignored mine? What exactly makes me different?" Ethan's face twisted with discomfort. He rolled his eyes, just barely, but it was enough for Camille to catch. "Look, lady," he said, exasperated. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. Maybe you're just careful." Camille interrupted, her voice razor-sharp. "Finish that sentence." Ethan clamped his mouth shut, realizing too late that he had nearly crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Camille's eyes locked onto his, daring him to say what she already knew was lingering on the tip of his tongue. For a brief moment, an awkward silence fell between them. Other patrons glanced over, sensing the tension. Camille inhaled deeply, willing herself to stay composed. She had learned a long time ago that exploding with anger rarely did any good, especially in moments like these. But she was done playing nice. "Let me make something clear," she said, her voice steady but filled with quiet authority. "I don't care if you think I'm overreacting, or if you think I don't belong here. I do. And I'll stay as long as I please." Ethan smirked, the corners of his mouth curling up in smug defiance. "If you don't like the service, maybe you should find somewhere else to eat." Camille's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. "No," she said firmly. "I'll be eating here, and you will take my order. Now." Ethan's smirk faltered, but he jotted something down on his notepad, clearly annoyed. "Fine. What do you want?" "I'll take the filet mignon," Camille replied, her tone unwavering. "Medium rare. And a glass of your best Cabernet." Without so much as an acknowledgement, Ethan turned and walked toward the kitchen, his attitude still dripping with disrespect. Camille exhaled slowly, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She didn't regret standing her ground, but it was exhausting. She was tired of always having to assert herself, tired of the microaggressions, and tired of being treated as if she didn't belong. She glanced at her phone, hoping Matthew would arrive soon. He had promised he wouldn't be long, and Camille knew that once he showed up, things would change, dramatically. Sure enough, moments later, the familiar sound of the restaurant doors opening caught Camille's attention. She looked up, and her heart lifted slightly. There he was, Matthew, her husband and partner, walking through the doors with his usual commanding presence. Tall, confident, and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, Matthew made his way across the restaurant with the ease of someone who owned the place, which of course he did. His sharp brown eyes scanned the room until they landed on Camille. When their gazes met, Camille felt a wave of calm wash over her, though her frustration still simmered just beneath the surface. Matthew strode toward her, cutting through the restaurant like a blade through water. Ethan, returning from the kitchen with a tray in hand, caught sight of him and froze mid-step. The color drained from his face as he realized who Matthew was. Camille could see the panic in Ethan's eyes as the waiter's earlier bravado crumbled. He knew, he finally knew, that the woman he had been mistreating all evening was not just another diner. She was the wife of the restaurant's owner. Matthew reached the table and leaned down to kiss Camille gently on the cheek. "Sorry I'm late, love," he murmured. Camille smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "You're just in time," she whispered back. Matthew straightened, turning his full attention to Ethan, who stood frozen with the tray in his hands, looking like a man who had just realized he was standing on thin ice. Was only just beginning. "Ethan, isn't it?" Matthew said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Ethan swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance replaced by sheer panic. Yes, sir." Matthew gave him a long, assessing look. "It seems we need to have a conversation about how we treat all of our guests here at Bistro Nouveau. Don't you agree?" Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he nodded, realizing that the storm he had invited upon himself was only just beginning. And Camille, sitting quietly at the table, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. This, she thought, was far from over. The weight of consequences. The air between Ethan, Matthew, and Camille hung thick with unspoken tension, like a coiled wire ready to snap. Ethan stood awkwardly, tray in hand, the cocky facade he'd worn all evening unraveling. With each second that passed under Matthew's intense gaze, his sense of control evaporated, leaving behind only raw panic. "Come with me to the back," Matthew said softly, but there was a gravity to his words that made Ethan's heart sink. It wasn't a request. Camille watched with quiet satisfaction as Ethan lowered the tray to a side station and followed Matthew toward the kitchen doors, his steps heavy and reluctant. The restaurant, though still buzzing with conversation and clinking silverware, had shifted. Several patrons had taken notice of the tense exchange, their curious glances following the pair toward the back. Camille took a slow sip of her water, exhaling the tension that had built up inside her. For now, the ball was in Matthew's court, and she trusted her husband to handle the situation the way only he could. Firm, fair, but without an ounce of tolerance for nonsense. In the back office, Ethan stood awkwardly, shifting his weight from foot to foot as Matthew closed the door behind them. The tiny office, crammed with shelves of paperwork and inventory logs, felt even smaller under the weight of Matthew's piercing gaze. "Let's start simple," Matthew said, his voice calm but unforgiving. "What exactly happened out there?" Ethan swallowed hard, struggling to come up with a response that didn't incriminate him. "I was busy, sir. I didn't mean to." Matthew raised a hand, silencing him. "Stop." The word cut through Ethan's weak excuse like a knife. "This isn't about being busy," Matthew continued, his voice cold. "It's about the way you chose to treat one of our guests. Not just any guest, my wife. But you didn't know that, did you?" Ethan's face flushed a deep shade of red. "No, sir. I didn't know." "And if you had known," Matthew asked, leaning forward slightly, "would it have changed the way you treated her?" Ethan stammered, trying to find the right words. I would have been more polite. You would have done your job properly," Matthew finished for him. His voice was sharper now, each word measured and deliberate. "But you didn't, because you thought she wasn't important. You thought you could get away with it." Ethan lowered his eyes, shame curling around his spine like a heavy chain. He knew there was no digging himself out of this one. Matthew folded his arms across his chest. "I built Bistro Nouveau with two principles in mind. Excellent food and respect for every person who walks through that door. I don't care if they're dining alone, coming in late, or look different from our typical crowd. Everyone gets the same level of care. That's non-negotiable." Ethan's throat tightened as the weight of Matthew's words settled over him. This wasn't just a scolding. It was a wake-up call, and the cost of ignoring it could be steep. Back in the dining room, Camille sat at her table, her anger cooled but still simmering just beneath the surface. The interaction with Ethan had been just one of many moments in her life where she had to push back against subtle disrespect. But this one hit differently. It was personal. Bistro Nouveau was her second home, and tonight, it had betrayed her. She scanned the room again, catching glimpses of other diners enjoying their meals, laughing over candlelight, unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. It was a reminder of the subtle ways the world treated people differently, based on little more than appearances and assumptions. Camille knew she didn't fit the mold of a typical guest for an upscale bistro, and Ethan's treatment was a painful reminder that no amount of success could shield her from bias. She sighed, shaking her head. This wasn't the future she had imagined when she and Matthew first opened the restaurant. They had poured their hearts into this place, hoping to create something welcoming for everyone. But tonight had proved there was still work to do. Matthew returns. 15 minutes later, the door to the kitchen swung open, and Matthew emerged, his expression unreadable. Ethan trailed behind him, head down, looking like a child sent to the principal's office. Camille raised an eyebrow as the two men approached her table. Matthew rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder before addressing Ethan. "There's something Ethan would like to say," Matthew said, his voice calm but firm. Ethan shuffled uncomfortably, clearly dreading the moment. I'm sorry, ma'am," he muttered, barely meeting Camille's gaze. "I shouldn't have treated you like that. It was disrespectful, and it won't happen again." Camille regarded him coolly, her expression unreadable. She appreciated the apology, but she wasn't quite ready to let him off the hook. Apologies, after all, were only meaningful if followed by real change. "Thank you for the apology," she said evenly. "But I hope you understand that respect isn't just about words. It's about actions, every day, with every person." Ethan nodded quickly, eager for the conversation to end. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." Matthew gave him a pointed look. "I'll be keeping an eye on you, Ethan. If I ever see this kind of behavior again, you'll be out the door before you can finish apologizing." "Understood." "Yes, sir," Ethan whispered, clearly humbled. Matthew nodded toward the kitchen. "You can get back to work." Ethan gave a small, awkward bow and scurried off, disappearing into the kitchen. A moment of reflection. Matthew sat down across from Camille, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Camille leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "I'm better now," she admitted, giving him a small smile. "Thank you for handling that." Matthew reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "No one treats you that way. Not here. Not anywhere." Camille squeezed his hand, grateful for his unwavering support. But the night had left her with a sense of unease, a reminder that no matter how much they achieved, there would always be people like Ethan, quick to make assumptions and slow to show respect. As the waiter, now a different one, brought her filet mignon and wine, Camille felt a sense of bittersweet triumph. She had stood her ground, and Matthew had backed her up. But the battle wasn't just about one rude waiter. It was about changing the culture, one small moment at a time, a plan for the future. As they ate, Camille and Matthew talked about more than just the events of the evening. They discussed ways to make Bistro Nouveau even more inclusive, staff training, better hiring practices, and a renewed focus on customer experience. "We'll make sure this never happens again," Matthew promised. Camille nodded, feeling a spark of hope reignite within her. Bistro Nouveau had been tested tonight, but it wasn't broken. They would rebuild stronger, together. And as they shared dessert, Camille allowed herself to believe that, one day, places like Bistro Nouveau wouldn't need to fight so hard to prove that everyone belonged. For tonight, though, the battle was won, and that was enough. Beneath the surface, in the stillness of their shared meal, Camille couldn't help but notice the flickers of weariness in Matthew's eyes. lines at the corners from years of late nights and countless service hours. This restaurant was as much a part of them as their marriage. They had poured love, ambition, and endless sacrifices into Bistro Nouveau. But tonight's experience highlighted something deeper, even in a place they owned. Camille wasn't fully shielded from the biases that seemed to sneak in like unwelcome guests. Matthew seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts. As he poured her another glass of wine, his voice dropped to a softer register. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Camille smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can't help it." She swirled the wine in her glass, watching the deep red liquid glint under the candlelight. "It's not just Ethan. It's the whole idea that people assume things about me. Sometimes I feel like no matter how much we achieve, I'm still invisible to them." Matthew leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, his brow furrowing in quiet contemplation. "I hate that you have to feel that way." "It's not your fault, love," Camille said gently, squeezing his hand. "But I do wonder how many other people come in here and feel exactly like I did tonight. People we don't even notice. What if this restaurant, despite everything we've tried, isn't as welcoming as we think it is?" The question lingered between them, heavy with uncomfortable possibilities. Bistro Nouveau had always prided itself on being a sanctuary for good food and good company, but Camille knew firsthand how easy it was for cracks to form beneath the surface. Matthew gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Then we'll fix it. We'll dig deeper, make sure we're living up to what we say we are." Camille exhaled slowly. "I want more than a quick fix, Matthew. I want us to build something real, something lasting. A place where no one feels out of place." A conversation in the kitchen. While Matthew and Camille spoke quietly over their meal, Ethan leaned against a stainless steel counter in the back kitchen, gnawing on his lower lip. The other waitstaff worked around him, too busy to engage, but the reprimand from Matthew still echoed in his mind. The weight of his behavior sat heavy on him, heavier than he'd expected. His arrogance had always been a flimsy cover for insecurities he didn't like to admit, but now that flimsy shield had shattered. All he'd seen earlier was a well-dressed woman dining alone, showing up late in the evening, a combination he'd subconsciously pegged as not worth his effort. But now, after hearing who she was and realizing how deeply his actions had offended both her and Matthew, something inside him cracked. He had messed up. Badly. Chef Ricardo, the head chef, paused beside Ethan, wiping his hands on his apron. "Got a lot on your mind, huh?" Ethan nodded wordlessly. The chef grinned, a quick, tired smile that showed he'd seen this kind of thing before. "Listen, kid. We've all screwed up at some point, but you've got two choices now. Let it fester or use it to change. Which one are you gonna pick?" Ethan shrugged, but there was something thoughtful in his expression. "I don't know, chef. Just feels like I really blew it tonight." Ricardo chuckled softly. "Of course you blew it, but the only thing that'll make it worse is pretending you didn't." He patted Ethan's shoulder. "Now, if you want a second chance, you better make sure the people you hurt can see you're serious about earning it." Ethan gave a small, reluctant nod, unsure what redemption would look like, but knowing that it was something he had to try for. Reflections and realizations. Back at the table, Camille and Matthew's conversation deepened as they explored what it would take to make Bistro Nouveau more inclusive, genuinely, not just on paper. They talked about diversity training, hiring policies, and even consulting with community organizations to help them identify their blind spots. "We can start small," Camille said, her mind buzzing with ideas. "Maybe anonymous feedback forms, something that gives people a chance to tell us how they really felt about their experience. And we need more than just policies. I want real stories. I want to know what our guests are experiencing." Matthew nodded, already imagining how they could build this new layer into their business. It was daunting, but it also felt invigorating. Bistro Nouveau had always been about more than just food. It was about connection, about making people feel seen and valued. They had lost sight of that tonight, but they could find their way back. Ethan's decision. Later that night, as the restaurant began to quiet and the last few guests lingered over dessert, Ethan made a choice. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could try to make things right. He approached Matthew and Camille's table cautiously, waiting until the moment felt right to speak. "Excuse me," he began, clearing his throat nervously. I wanted to say something else, if that's okay." Camille arched a brow, but nodded, curious about what he had to say. "I know I already apologized," Ethan continued, his voice low and sincere. "But I don't think that was enough. What I did wasn't just rude. It was wrong. And I want to do better. I mean it. I know words aren't much, but I'll prove it with my actions." Camille regarded him thoughtfully for a moment, weighing the sincerity in his tone. There was still a part of her that felt guarded, but she appreciated his effort. "I'll hold you to that, Ethan," she said softly. "Actions do speak louder than words." Ethan nodded gratefully, relief washing over him. "Thank you. I won't forget this." A new beginning. By the time Camille and Matthew finished their meal, the atmosphere between them had lightened. The tension of the evening was still there, but now it felt like an opportunity rather than a burden. As they walked toward the exit, Matthew wrapped an arm around Camille's shoulders, pulling her close. "You know," he said with a smile, "I think tonight might have been a turning point, for all of us." Camille chuckled. "A painful one, but yeah, I think you're right." When they reached the door, Camille glanced back at the warm glow of the restaurant behind them, the soft hum of conversation, and the clinking of glasses. Bistro Nouveau wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and it was worth fighting for. The days that followed. Over the next few weeks, Bistro Nouveau underwent quiet but meaningful changes. They implemented anonymous guest feedback, offered staff workshops focused on empathy and service, and even began holding regular team discussions where everyone, chefs, waiters, and managers, could share their experiences openly. And something began to shift. Guests who had once felt invisible found themselves greeted with genuine warmth. Employees, too, started treating one another with a new level of respect, understanding that each interaction mattered. Ethan, for his part, became a different kind of waiter. He went out of his way to connect with guests, learning to listen without assumptions. His transformation wasn't perfect. He still had his moments, but the effort was there, and it didn't go unnoticed. Camille watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of pride. Bistro Nouveau was becoming the place she'd always dreamed it could be, a place where everyone belonged, where every person felt seen and valued. And as she stood at the entrance one evening, watching the glow of the dining room from the doorway, Camille smiled to herself. They weren't just running a restaurant. They were building a legacy. Echoes of the past, hopes for the future. The next morning, Camille found herself standing in the soft light of dawn at the entrance of Bistro Nouveau, a quiet moment she rarely experienced. The restaurant was closed, but she came early, drawn not by duty, but by reflection. With the front doors still locked, she ran her fingers along the familiar wood grain of the entrance, feeling the grooves worn smooth by years of eager patrons. This place had been more than a dream. It had been salvation. Bistro Nouveau wasn't just about food. It was about second chances, both for her and Matthew. Their story, entwined with the rise of the restaurant, was a testament to perseverance. She thought of the years they spent building this business from scratch, the sacrifices they made, the nights they worked well past midnight, and the personal doubts she fought through when she wondered if she truly belonged in a space where people often dismissed her at first glance. A wave of memories washed over her, bringing back moments both joyful and painful. The early struggles. When Camille and Matthew first opened Bistro Nouveau, they thought the hardest part would be getting customers through the door. They quickly learned that the real challenge wasn't filling seats, it was earning respect. Matthew, a white man with culinary training abroad, was often praised as the face of the restaurant, while Camille's role, though equal in every sense, was repeatedly minimized. During the early years, people would often mistake her for a hostess or administrative assistant. No matter how much work she put into managing operations, curating the wine list, or establishing relationships with vendors, recognition always seemed just out of reach. Even friends and acquaintances would sometimes ask Matthew how his restaurant was doing, as if Camille were a silent partner. There were days she felt like giving up, like retreating into the background where no one would question her presence. But every time those thoughts surfaced, Matthew had been there, standing beside her, reminding her that this place was theirs. "Let them underestimate us," he had said once during one of her hardest nights. "We'll show them what real partnership looks like." And they had. Together, they'd built Bistro Nouveau into a thriving hub, a place that reflected both their values and their vision. Yet, even after all those years, moments like the one last night reminded Camille that the fight wasn't over. A phone call from the past. Just as the memory began to fade, Camille's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced down at the screen. The name surprised her. It was Deirdre Ellis, an old college friend she hadn't spoken to in years. Camille answered, curiosity outweighing the awkwardness. "Deirdre? Wow, it's been a while." The voice on the other end was warm, if slightly hesitant. "Hey, Camille. I know it's out of the blue, but I heard about the restaurant from a mutual friend. I just wanted to check in. And, well, to apologize." Camille's brow furrowed as she leaned against the doorway. "Apologize? For what?" Deirdre's voice softened. "I wasn't always the best friend back in the day. I remember how some of us treated you, like you didn't quite belong in certain spaces, and I realize now how hurtful that must have been. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I see you, Camille, and I admire what you've built." The sincerity in Deirdre's words caught Camille off guard. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. "Thank you," Camille whispered. "That means more than you know." They talked for a few minutes more, catching up on life, exchanging updates on careers and family. As the conversation wound down, Camille felt something lift, an old wound she hadn't realized she was still carrying, finally beginning to heal, the beginning of something new. Later that morning, Camille sat with Matthew at their kitchen table, her mind still processing both the events of the previous night and the unexpected call from Deirdre. "It's funny," she said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "I spent so many years trying to prove myself, proving that I belong, that I deserve to be here. But I think maybe it's time to stop proving and just start being." Matthew looked at her with that quiet, steady gaze she had come to love over the years. "What does that look like for you?" Camille smiled, feeling the beginnings of an idea stirring within her. "It looks like leaning into who I am, not just as a restaurateur or your partner, but as me. I think it's time we let Bistro Nouveau evolve into something more than just a restaurant. I want it to be a space where people feel like they truly belong, from the kitchen to the front of the house to the guests who walk through the door." Matthew's smile was slow, but full of understanding. "So, what's the first step?" Camille tapped a finger against her mug, thinking. "We start with a community night, invite people from all backgrounds to share a meal, no matter their ability to pay. I want to create moments of connection, where conversations happen between people who might never cross paths otherwise." Matthew grinned. "I love it. And maybe we partner with local artists or musicians, turn it into something more than just dinner." Camille's eyes lit up. "Yes, and we could feature dishes inspired by staff members' cultures, give everyone a chance to tell their story through food." They spent the next hour brainstorming ideas, their excitement growing with every passing minute. Bistro Nouveau had always been their labor of love, but now it felt like they were on the verge of something new, something bigger. Ethan's efforts began to show. As the weeks passed, Ethan made good on his promise. He started small, greeting every guest with genuine warmth, taking the time to learn names and preferences. He sought out moments to connect with coworkers too, volunteering for tasks no one else wanted, and making sure his actions matched his words. One day, Camille overheard a conversation between Ethan and another waiter. "I don't want to be the kind of person who judges people before I know them," Ethan said quietly. "Last month made me realize how easy it is to mess up and how hard it is to fix things. But I'm trying. That's all I can do, right?" The other waiter smiled. "That's all any of us can do." Camille felt a flicker of pride. Bistro Nouveau was changing, not just outwardly, but from within. An evening of connection. The first community night at Bistro Nouveau was a resounding success. The dining room buzzed with conversation as strangers shared meals and stories, their differences melting away over bowls of steaming soup and plates of fragrant dishes. Musicians played soft jazz in the background, and the walls were adorned with artwork created by local students. At one point, Camille stood by the bar, watching the scene unfold with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. This was what she had always wanted, a place where people felt welcome, no matter who they were or where they came from. Matthew joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "We did it," he whispered. Camille smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "No," she said softly. "We're doing it, and that's the beauty of it. It's just the beginning." As the evening stretched on, Camille felt a quiet certainty settle in her heart. Bistro Nouveau was more than just a restaurant. It was a home, a place where stories were shared, connections were made, and everyone belonged. And in that moment, Camille knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with open hearts and a table always ready to welcome one more. "You said, continue with part 6 more unique and lengthy," ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Part 6. Turning Tables and Changing Tides. 2 months had passed since the inaugural community night at Bistro Nouveau, and the restaurant buzzed with new energy. Word had spread beyond their regular clientele. Bistro Nouveau wasn't just known for exquisite meals, but as a hub of shared stories and meaningful connections. People from all walks of life found their way to the bistro, drawn by its open doors and inclusive spirit. Camille walked through the dining area one busy Friday evening, taking in the lively atmosphere. At one table, a retired teacher animatedly chatted with a young barista about literature. At another, an immigrant couple shared stories from their homeland while tasting a dish that reminded them of home. She heard the sound of a violin weaving through the conversations, played by a street performer they had invited in exchange for dinner. Camille exhaled a deep breath, her heart full. The bistro's transformation felt like a dream she hadn't dared imagine, one where the walls were not just decorated with art, but resonated with the voices of a community growing together. Old customers, new challenges. But change never came without its resistance. As much as new guests embraced the shift, not everyone was enthusiastic. A handful of longtime patrons, wealthy regulars who were accustomed to exclusivity, found the new direction unsettling. On more than one occasion, Camille noticed strained expressions from these guests as they dined among strangers they wouldn't typically encounter in their social circles. One such couple, the Somervilles, made their displeasure known by demanding a private table away from the noise. "We've been loyal customers for years," Mrs. Somerville complained to Ethan one evening. "This place used to feel refined. Now it's chaotic." Camille overheard the exchange as she passed by. Instead of intervening immediately, she watched Ethan carefully. His posture remained calm, though his knuckles tightened slightly as he gripped the order pad. "Bistro Nouveau is evolving," Ethan said politely, but with quiet firmness. "We're focusing on creating connections. It's different, yes, but it's still the same in spirit. Good food, good people." Mrs. Somerville sniffed, clearly unimpressed. "I see. Well, we'll consider coming back, if things return to normal." Camille felt a knot form in her stomach as the Somervilles left, their departure marked by an exaggerated huff. She turned to Ethan with a questioning look, but he simply shrugged, offering a sheepish grin. "Well," he said, "at least I didn't call them out like last time." Camille chuckled softly, appreciating Ethan's growth. He was learning to handle difficult moments with grace, not perfectly, but with effort and care. Navigating new alliances. Meanwhile, Camille and Matthew found themselves receiving inquiries from local organizations interested in partnering with Bistro Nouveau. Nonprofits, community centers, and even small business coalitions wanted to collaborate, recognizing the bistro as more than just a place to eat. It had become a space where meaningful relationships were formed. One partnership stood out, a mentorship program with a culinary school Camille had once attended. It was the same institution where she had first struggled with imposter syndrome, questioning whether she belonged among classmates who came from more privileged backgrounds. The director of the program, an energetic woman named Linda Chung, called Camille personally. "We'd love for Bistro Nouveau to become part of our mentorship initiative," Linda said. "Our students need to see what it looks like when a restaurateur brings not just skill but heart to their work." Camille hesitated for a moment, emotions stirring beneath the surface. Her experience at culinary school had left scars she wasn't sure had fully healed. Could she really go back, not as a student this time, but as a mentor? "I'll do it," Camille said finally, her voice steady. "But only if we make this program about more than just skills. I want it to be about identity, about belonging in the kitchen, not fitting into someone else's mold." Linda's enthusiastic agreement sealed the deal, and Camille felt a deep sense of purpose rise within her. Bistro Nouveau's mission was expanding, and she was ready to lead the charge. A storm brews, in and out of the kitchen. While the bistro thrived on its new path, life outside the restaurant brought unexpected challenges. Matthew's father, Henry, had fallen ill, and the couple had to make difficult decisions about how to care for him. Henry had never fully accepted Matthew's decision to build a restaurant with Camille, believing his son should have pursued a more conventional career. Over the years, his relationship with Matthew had been polite but distant, and with Camille, it was outright strained. When Matthew suggested moving his father into their home, Camille felt conflicted. "Are you sure that's the best idea?" she asked gently, as they sat together late one night. Matthew rubbed his temples, looking exhausted. "He's my dad, Cam. I can't just leave him alone. Maybe this is our chance to fix things." Camille swallowed her frustration, understanding the depth of Matthew's hope even if she didn't share it. The thought of having Henry under their roof was daunting, but she knew how important family was to Matthew. "Okay," she said quietly. "We'll figure it out. Together." A quiet victory in an unexpected place. Henry's arrival wasn't easy. He grumbled at the changes around the house, made pointed remarks about the restaurant, and rarely acknowledged Camille. But over time, small cracks began to appear in his rigid demeanor. One rainy afternoon, Camille returned from the restaurant to find Henry sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through an old photo album of Bistro Nouveau's early days. "This was your idea, wasn't it?" Henry asked, tapping a photo of the bistro's original, minimalist menu. Camille nodded, unsure where the conversation was going. Henry exhaled slowly, his gaze lingering on the picture. "It's not what I expected, but you've built something good here. Better than I ever gave you credit for." Camille's breath hitched, the weight of his words settling over her like an unexpected gift. She wasn't sure if it was an apology or just an acknowledgement, but either way, it was enough. A new rhythm. As the months went on, Bistro Nouveau found its rhythm. Community nights became a beloved tradition, and the mentorship program flourished, with students eager to learn from Camille's unique perspective. Ethan, now fully integrated into the team, was planning to host his own dinner event, an evening dedicated to street food from around the world, inspired by his travels. Camille stood by the entrance one evening, watching guests filter in. She smiled as she saw familiar faces among the crowd. Ethan's parents, the musicians who had performed at their first community night, even the Somervilles, who, despite their initial hesitation, had returned to experience the bistro's new vibe. Matthew appeared at her side, slipping his hand into hers. "Looks like we're doing something right," he murmured. Camille leaned against him, content. We are. And we're just getting started. A toast to tomorrow. Later that night, after the last guests had left, the staff gathered around the bar for a toast. Ethan raised his glass, a mischievous grin on his face, to Bistro Nouveau, for proving that the best things happen when we stop trying to be perfect and just focus on being real. Laughter and cheers echoed through the empty restaurant, and Camille felt a profound sense of belonging. Bistro Nouveau wasn't just a business or even a dream fulfilled. It was a reflection of everything they valued: community, connection, and the courage to embrace change. As she clinked glasses with her team, Camille knew one thing for certain: whatever the future held, they were ready for it, together.